On the muddy, windswept plains of Texas, in the heart of the Lone Star State, a quiet revolution was unfolding. It was April 1945, and the war was nearing its brutal climax in Europe. The Allies had pushed through the heart of Germany, and prisoners of war, soldiers who had once fought with unwavering loyalty to the Third Reich, were now caught in the sprawling web of American captivity. These men, who had once reveled in the false glory of their uniform, found themselves in the hands of a foreign force, their pride shattered, their future uncertain. They had seen their comrades fall, their cities burn, and now they were prisoners of a war they never expected to lose. It was at a camp near the Texas-Mexico border that the story would unfold, one that would forever change the lives of those involved. As dusk settled, the prisoners were lined up by the barbed wire fences, their uniforms faded, their faces gaunt from the years of hardship. The air, thick with dust and the scent of metal, seemed to close in around them as they stood under the watchful eyes of the American guards. Among them was a Texas cowboy, a man of the land, used to the vast emptiness of the open plains, but now tasked with something far more complicated, overseeing the care and well-being of the enemy soldiers. His name was Sergeant Roy Tex Harris, and though his uniform was simple, his reputation was far from ordinary. Raised on the rugged terrain of West Texas, Harris was a man shaped by the land, a cowboy who had honed the skills of survival and grit. But there was something in him that set him apart from the hardened soldiers around him. He had seen the ugliness of war, but it hadn't soured him. His heart, though battered by the harshness of battle, still carried a trace of compassion. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who believed in decency, a man who saw others not as enemies, but as human beings caught in an unforgiving tide. The first time he walked among the German prisoners, his boots heavy against the dry ground, there was silence. The men looked at him with suspicion, their eyes narrowed, calculating. To them, he was just another American soldier, a cog in the vast machine of war that had obliterated everything they had once known. But to Harris, they were more than prisoners. They were lost souls, stripped of everything but their will to survive. And it was that will that he intended to reach. He didn't speak much at first, just the occasional word of instruction and a nod here and there. The prisoners, though disheveled and hungry, had an unspoken camaraderie, a bond forged in the trenches of war. They understood each other in a way that Harris could never truly grasp. He could see the defiance in their eyes, the embers of pride that refused to die, no matter the conditions. But he also saw something else, fear. Fear of the unknown, of what awaited them in the days to come. And it was that fear that Harris sought to disarm. Rather than the harsh treatment expected from a soldier of his stature, Harris took a different approach. Instead of threats or violence, he extended kindness. He offered food with a warm smile, something the prisoners hadn't seen in years. He spoke to them not as captives, but as people, with respect and dignity. Some of the older men, veterans of battles long forgotten by history, would stand tall and salute him, their faces weary but grateful. There was no mockery, no scorn in their gestures, only a mutual recognition that something had shifted in the balance of power. The German soldiers, who had spent their lives under the oppressive hand of Nazi rule, began to see Harris not as a foe, but as an unexpected ally. But it wasn't just the men that Harris reached. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the camp grew quiet. The laughter of the soldiers had long since faded, but there were other sounds, the sounds of women quietly singing. Harris had heard the rumors, of course. There were whispers among the camp about the presence of female prisoners, women who had been taken from their homes, women who had once been part of the Nazi war machine, and now found themselves in the same captivity as their male counterparts. Some were nurses, others were part of the auxiliary services, but all had been stripped of their roles, their lives upended in an instant. One evening, Harris made his way to the far side of the camp. The path was dimly lit, the air still, and as he drew closer, he could hear the voices of the women. They were singing softly, the melody floating across the barren landscape, echoing in the empty space between the barbed wire fences. It was a haunting tune, filled with sadness and yearning, yet there was a strange sense of beauty in it. The women, just like the men, had been humbled by the war. But Harris, in his quiet cowboy way, knew that there was something more to them, a strength that had been forged through hardship. And just like with the men, He didn't approach them with scorn or fear. Instead, he offered them his own brand of kindness, treating them not as prisoners, but as women who had suffered the same fate as everyone else. In a moment that would be remembered for years to come, Harris spoke to the women. His voice, deep and steady, cut through the silence. "I don't know what brought you to this place," he said, "but I do know this. You deserve respect, and I'm here to make sure you get it." His words, simple as they were, carried weight. It wasn't just the sentiment of the words, but the sincerity in his voice that struck the women. In their eyes, Harris became something more than just a soldier. He became a symbol of something they had long forgotten: humanity. It was the kindness of a cowboy that won them over, not the chains of war, not the cruel power of an enemy, but the simple truth that he saw them as equals, as human beings deserving of decency. As the war drew to a close, and the prisoners were gradually released, there was no fanfare, no grand speeches or celebrations. There was only the quiet dignity of those who had survived the unthinkable. And for those German women, their lives would never be the same. The Texas cowboy had shown them that there was more to humanity than war and hatred, more to life than the chains that had bound them. Harris, for his part, returned to his ranch after the war, but he would never forget the faces of those women, the quiet gratitude in their eyes. And in the years that followed, when the world seemed to forget the sacrifices of war, Harris would continue to live by the same principle he had learned on the fields of Texas. Kindness was the greatest weapon of all. The world had changed, but Harris's legacy, the legacy of a cowboy who won over hearts not with violence, but with kindness, would endure. As the months passed and the prisoners began to adapt to the new reality of their captivity, a subtle yet profound shift took place. The German soldiers, who had once believed in the iron grip of their ideology, began to experience something they hadn't in years: compassion. It was an unexpected form of resistance to the brutality of war. The sight of Harris walking among them, offering food and speaking with kindness, became a symbol of resistance to the dehumanizing forces of war. No longer were they just captives. They were individuals with dignity, worthy of respect. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was real. German officers who once stood rigidly in the camp, their eyes cold and watchful, began to soften in Harris's presence. They had expected to be treated harshly, their arrogance as prisoners a reflection of their earlier supremacy on the battlefield. But instead of responding with disdain, Harris spoke to them as men who had been caught in the same storm. They, too, had lost everything, even if they refused to admit it. The humiliation they once imposed on others was now theirs to bear, but Harris was offering them something different, a way out of the bitter cycle of hatred. The prisoners' morale began to shift. At first, it was an internal process, a quiet rebellion against the conditioning of war that had taught them to view their captors as less than human. But as the days wore on, the change became visible. The prisoners who had once walked with heads down in silent fury began to straighten their backs. They spoke more freely, shared stories of their lives before the war, and occasionally cracked a smile when Harris would offer a joke or a word of encouragement. But it was the women, those women who had suffered the most in silence, who would benefit most from Harris's approach. It wasn't just about survival for them. It was about reclaiming their humanity. They had been used as instruments of war, as tools for the Nazi machine, and now, with the collapse of that regime, they were lost. Some had been nurses, others had been workers in the factories, and many had been coerced into service against their will. The emotional and physical toll on these women was immense. The war had broken them, and yet, they had not broken entirely. The camp had become their prison within a prison. Not only were they subjected to the violence and dehumanization of war, but they were also forced to endure the stigma of being associated with the enemy. They were outcasts in a world that had turned its back on them. But Harris, with his unassuming charm and unwavering sense of justice, saw something more. He saw women who, though scarred by the horrors of war, still carried within them the spark of life, the resilience to rise above their circumstances. In quiet moments, he would speak to them in the same calm tone that had won the respect of the men. He didn't ask them about the past. There was no need. He simply acknowledged their suffering and offered them what little he could: his time, his attention, and his respect. In the silence between words, in the shared moments of humanity, something incredible began to unfold. The women, once reluctant to even speak to their captors, now found themselves opening up. They began to tell Harris about their lives before the war, about the families they had left behind, the hopes they had once carried. For the first time in years, they found themselves treated as equals, not as subordinates or enemies. They were women, human beings, with stories that deserved to be heard. And as the weeks turned into months, Harris's efforts began to take shape in ways he could not have anticipated. One woman, Helga, who had been a nurse in Berlin, approached him one evening as the camp grew quiet under the fading light. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't treat us like the others," she said. "You treat us like we matter." The words struck Harris deeply. He had never seen himself as anything special. He was just a cowboy, raised on the principles of fairness and respect. But to Helga, and to the others, his actions had meant the world. In a world torn apart by violence and hatred, kindness had become a weapon more powerful than any gun or tank. And it had changed the course of their lives. Helga wasn't the only one. Over time, more and more of the women found themselves drawn to Harris's quiet strength. They began to help him in small ways, tending to the camp's gardens, mending uniforms, and assisting in the distribution of food. Their actions, though simple, were a powerful statement. They had not only survived the war, they had begun to rebuild their lives. Harris had given them the strength to do that, without even realizing the full impact of his actions. But Harris's kindness didn't just stop at the women. The male prisoners, too, began to adopt his approach. They saw the effect his behavior had on their captors, and soon, they began to emulate it. It was an unspoken understanding that kindness, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, was the truest form of strength. By the time the war ended, the camp had undergone a transformation. What was once a place of harsh captivity, filled with suspicion and anger, had become a place of healing, where respect and dignity were the cornerstones of life. Harris, the cowboy from Texas, had achieved something that few could have ever imagined. He had won over the hearts of his enemies, not with force, but with kindness. When the prisoners were finally released and sent back to their respective countries, the memories of their time in that camp stayed with them. For the German women, their lives had been irrevocably altered by the kindness of one man. They would return home with stories of a Texas cowboy who had shown them that even in the darkest times, humanity still had a place in the world. For Harris, life returned to normal after the war. He returned to his ranch, but the lessons he had learned in that camp remained with him. He would go on to live a long and peaceful life, always remembering the faces of those he had helped, not as enemies, but as human beings. And in the quiet moments of his old age, when the winds of West Texas swept across the plains, he would remember the women's smiles, the laughter that had once been so rare, and the legacy he had left behind, a legacy of kindness in a world at war. Years after the war had ended, the impact of Harris's actions began to ripple through the broader landscape of post-war Europe. As the German soldiers and their families slowly rebuilt their lives, the legend of the Texas cowboy who had won over their hearts spread, though not in the way one might think. It wasn't a tale told in grand speeches or headlines, but in quiet conversations among those who had been there. Harris's story wasn't one of heroism in the conventional sense. There were no medals, no grand accolades. Yet it was one of the most enduring legacies of the post-war period. For those German women who had been prisoners, the war was far from over once they returned home. They were not only victims of the Allied forces, but were now seen by many in their own country as collaborators with the enemy. They had been caught in a brutal and unforgiving web of ideology, forced into a position where survival had meant becoming part of the machinery of war. But as the war receded into the past, so did their stigmatization. They had lived through something no one could fully understand, and they carried scars, both seen and unseen, that would take years to heal. Yet in the midst of this struggle for reintegration, Harris's kindness remained a beacon. For Helga and the others, his actions had symbolized something far greater than a simple act of mercy. It had given them the strength to reclaim their identity, to rebuild a sense of self-worth in a world that had stripped them of it. The memory of his soft-spoken, unwavering belief in their humanity was something they held onto tightly, especially in moments of doubt. He had shown them that compassion was a force more powerful than hatred, more enduring than the cruel hand of war. Harris, in the years following the war, kept his life simple. He returned to his ranch, living the quiet, unassuming life of a cowboy, far removed from the fame or recognition that could have followed his actions. He continued to tend to his cattle, ride the plains, and offer his brand of quiet wisdom to those who sought it. But despite his reticence, those who knew him and those who heard his story could not help but see him as something more than just a cowboy. He had become a symbol of the human potential for kindness, even in the darkest of times. As the decades passed and the memories of the war began to fade, Harris's legacy continued to live on. His name was quietly spoken among those who had served in the camp, shared by German and American veterans alike, and his story was told not as one of a grand military victory, but of a quiet triumph over the brutality of war. He had shown that the greatest weapon wasn't steel or firepower, but the ability to see beyond the uniforms, beyond the hatred, and to reach the heart of a person. But it wasn't just the war that had shaped Harris. He had also been shaped by it. The war had taught him, perhaps more than any other experience, that humanity was not something defined by borders, ideologies, or uniforms. It was something far more fundamental. The ability to offer kindness, to treat another person with dignity, was not just an act of mercy, it was an act of resistance. In a world that had been torn apart by ideologies and violence, Harris had proven that the simplest of acts, a smile, a kind word, a moment of respect, could change everything. And so, Harris's actions became more than just a personal legacy. They became a part of the fabric of post-war reconciliation. As nations rebuilt, as families reunited, and as individuals sought to heal from the wounds of war, Harris's example remained a touchstone of what was possible in the face of unimaginable adversity. His legacy was one of quiet strength, of a man who had shown that war was not only fought on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who were caught in its wake. In the years after the war, as Germany rebuilt itself, a new generation grew up, one that had never known the horrors of war firsthand, but had been shaped by its shadow. For many, the story of the Texas cowboy became more than just a footnote in history. It was a reminder of the potential for change, even in the most impossible of circumstances. And for those who remembered Harris, the lesson was clear. Even in the darkest moments of human history, the light of kindness could shine through, offering a path forward when it seemed like none existed. As Harris's story continued to be passed down through the generations, it became a quiet testament to the power of the human spirit. It was a reminder that even in a world scarred by violence and hatred, compassion could still be the most revolutionary force of all. And perhaps, in that quiet revolution, Harris had accomplished something far greater than any soldier ever could. He had changed hearts, and in doing so, had changed the course of lives forever. The legacy of that Texas cowboy, whose kindness had bridged the gap between enemy lines, lived on in the hearts of those he had touched. It was a legacy not written in medals or battlefields, but in the quiet, unspoken moments between human beings who had learned to see one another not as enemies, but as equals. Harris had proven that in the face of war's brutality, the most powerful weapon was not force, but the simple, enduring power of human kindness. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all.